Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second session of the 2024 Connections Online. This one is on distributed wargaming best practices. I am Chris Weuve. I am essentially the founder of Connections Online, and so I am also somebody who did a lot of thinking about distributed wargaming in the early time of COVID pandemic. Perhaps you saw the introduction that Pete Pellegrino and I just did. So what we're going to do in this panel, everybody here either did some serious thinking or in most cases actually executed a online distributed wargaming during the pandemic. So Pete and I already pretty much did our presentation in the intro. If you're watching this, if you're watching the recording, you can stop watching this one, go watch Pete and I to get our scene setter, and then come back and watch the rest of this. If you're watching it live, Pete and I will be part of the conversation, but we're not going to repeat we're not going to redo our presentations. Instead, we're going to start with some people here. We'll probably end up starting with Sean Barnett, who did some stuff related for his job. And then we'll go to Stephen Downs Martin and Charles Turnitsa, who did some academic work during this, in that they were part of a working group that tried to sort of think about how to do distributed wargaming. And last, we'll go to Ed McGrady, who did what? 4 distributed war games during the COVID time period?
I was literally just talking to people about doing a distributed wargaming 5 minutes ago. So
yeah. So Ed kind of permanently lives in this space these days, and so he's a good person to sort of do the final presentation there. And then after that, we'll have a discussion and we'll take questions from the audience. So with that in mind, Sean, take it away. Am I putting up your, let's see, I probably have to put up your slides, or Zachary has to do it.
And then you'll have to tell me how to drive them, or are you going to drive them for me?
Do you see a button at the bottom that lets you drive them? If you mouse over the slide, do you see something that comes up that gives you arrows?
I do. All right, very good. So
we'll let you drive, and I'm just going to turn off my microphone and my camera, but I'll be sitting here.
Okay. All right. I am Sean Barnett. Good morning, everyone. I'm an adjunct engineer at the RAND Corporation currently. Most of my work at RAND involves analytical military assessments and wargaming, but I've been involved in wargaming for many, many years on the hobby and commercial side as well. So that's my background. And I'm going to talk about some experiences that I had with distributed wargaming during the pandemic. I'm going to cover two subjects. The first is a large play-by-email wargame of the American Civil War Gettysburg campaign that I ran for about 5 months in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, if you will. And then I'm going to say a little bit about some RAND Corporation distributed wargames work we did for the Joint Staff. Although I'll say now that what I'm going to cover briefly, Pete and Chris covered in depth at 10 o'clock this morning. So if you want to hear a lot about issues with distributed wargaming for the Defense Department during the pandemic, you should go back and listen to their presentation, because they covered a lot of ground. So this is the Gettysburg campaign. On the right-hand side there, you see the map of the historical campaign in 1863 during the American Civil War. The Union and Confederate armies in early June were located around Fredericksburg, Virginia, at the bottom of the map. And when Lee began his invasion of the North that ended in the Battle of Gettysburg, what he did was his army, the Army of Northern Virginia, took off to the west and then moved north through the Shenandoah Valley, ultimately into Maryland and Pennsylvania. And then the Union Army, sometime shortly thereafter, Lee's departure, took off and moved on something of a parallel track. You see those blue lines there. And in early July, they ended up meeting at Gettysburg, and they fought the famous battle. So I ran this as a multi-blind Kriegspiel game for a few months over year 2020. I had about 29 players in the game across the U.S. and in the U.K. in the roles of Union and Confederate Army Corps and Cavalry Brigade commanders, and I'll get into why I did that. And that was really the big feature of the game, was running this big multiplayer, multi-blind game. And the distributed nature of the game, it was by email, It was driven by the multi-blind play that the distribution helped with that. And it accommodated pandemic restrictions on gathering. If people are working by themselves and they don't have problems with being in the same space with others that we encountered with face-to-face gaming. So the game objectives, like why do this? Why run this big multiplayer, multi-blind game? And the goals of the game were to inject more of the human commander element into the game and capture its nature as a battle for information, which the Gettysburg campaign largely was. Historically, during the American Civil War and during the Gettysburg campaign, the armies had to deal with separated forces commanded by individuals who are not in direct communication with each other. These could be armies, Army Corps, and certainly with the cavalry, down to brigades and even patrols that were separated from each other, where the humans in command couldn't communicate with each other rapidly. They had means of doing that by horse or by telegraph, but they couldn't speak to each other over a radio, for example, the way modern forces can. During most of this campaign, the historical armies were not in contact. For example, at the end of June, the Union Army headquarters was located at Frederick, Maryland, and the Confederate headquarters under Lee was located at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 35 miles away. The Confederate Second Corps was distributed at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and York, Pennsylvania, which was about 50 miles from the Union headquarters. So you can see that if the armies are going to fight and accomplish their objectives, they need to figure out where the enemy is and what to do about it, and they have to use the means at their disposal to collect information to do that. So much of the campaign was a battle for this information, finding the enemy without being found, and you see the various means that were available to the armies to do that. You had cavalry reconnaissance and then counter reconnaissance, of course. Scouts and spies used by both sides. And if you recall the movie Gettysburg, there's the Confederate spy reporting to James Longstreet about his observations of the movements of the Union Army. There were long-range observation stations, and these were established by the Union Army Signal Corps, where you had small units actually equipped with telescopes that allowed them to get onto mountaintops to observe the enemy at a distance up to about 20 miles away. There were other sources of intelligence. There were citizen reports and newspapers as the armies moved through areas. OPSEC was not then what it is today, and so you had newspapers reporting on the details of force movements that the enemy could rely on to learn about what was happening. And then with all of that, you had communication generally at the speed of a horse. The units would communicate with each other by sending messengers back and forth. The Union did have the availability of the telegraph if they were located near telegraph lines, and the telegraph lines weren't cut, which they could be at some time. So I wanted to capture all of those things. And face-to-face games typically don't model those things well. There's too much information available to the players, and a single player can play many roles at the same time. So the solution to this is to run this large multi-blind distributed game to replicate the challenges with the historical commanders to deal with, fighting for information, then dealing with the unknown. So how did we do this? How did I actually run this game? Well, we had the player orders provided by email, and those were narratives of the actions that the players wanted their units to take and their communications with others. So if you were a corps commander, do you want to send a message to a neighboring corps or back to the army commander, you could send a message to do that. And that was all done by email. Then the narratives would also include information like where players wanted to move and how they wanted to, whether they wanted to fight an imposing force that they ran into. Movement and combat were adjudicated by the referee, myself, as a Kriegspiel. I did have written rules for doing that, but the intent was to be a Kriegspiel game, not a board game played by email, but a looser game of the Kriegspiel form. The results were then transmitted back to the players by email, and we could get a turn done in about 3 to 7 real days each. That's receiving the information from the players, myself resolving it, and then sending it back. And then you can see on the right-hand side there, at the top image, that's a vassal screenshot that depicts some of the units in their relations to each other on one of the game turns. And then there's a message there, excuse me, back to one of the players reflecting what had happened to his unit. We use Vassal to track game information as a visualization aid, and most of the players had access to Vassal. Some players were using paper maps to track what was happening, but we were able to accommodate that between screenshots and then the text of the email. And we were successful. We managed to pull it off. We played the whole campaign to completion, which was very satisfying in the end. So in doing this, what were the observations? What was the effect of this distributed multi-blind game? Well, what we found was that the multi-blind game had a strong influence on play and the outcome. The players said it had a very different feel from a face-to-face game where you'd be standing around a table and looking at your units, looking at the enemy, looking at the map, and seeing everything all at once. The players dealt with limited information in various ways. They used their intelligence gathering tools to gain information, and then they acted on the information that they had. Sometimes they were able to take advantage of the fact that the enemy had limited information, couldn't see them. They could move around without being detected and intercepted. And other times they were surprised by the unknown. They got their units into trouble, or they missed out on opportunities that they could have grabbed, but they were concerned about what might have been out there where they couldn't see it. At the end of the day, superior Union situational awareness that was generated by their intelligence gathering capabilities and their players was the biggest factor in the outcome. It did end in a Union victory. And I have to say, I haven't named the players in this game, but our dearly departed friend Peter Perla was the Union commander, and the Union did prevail under his leadership. We had some issues with the game that we had to resolve. None of these were showstoppers. As I said, we were successful with the game, but these are things that we had to deal with. The first was the time. It was obviously a multi-month game. You had to get players to dedicate the time to that. Executing turns took several days, and so we just had to keep working at that to make it work. We had the players. We had 29 players, and I was fortunate in having 29 Wargamer friends or friends of friends who are willing and able to dedicate themselves to playing the game. We had to get the players to relate to each other and maintaining their engagement. And that's an issue with a distributed game. They're not in the same room relating to each other, enjoying the game. They're separated and in some cases, really isolated by COVID. And so we had to work to keep people engaged in the game. We made some adjustments to the combat system during the game. That's not a distributed gaming issue. It was just some tweaks we needed to make things a little more realistic. Likewise, with the communication rules, we had some mid-game changes. They had to provide some reminders to the players to keep them, don't talk to people that you're not in contact with. We had real life and that would take players away from the game at times or take their attention away from the game. And that's just, real life is something you have to deal with. And I think that actually today, it would be difficult to run a game like this because real life has come back, fortunately, after the pandemic. And, real life tends to be more important than games. And so it might be difficult to get people to dedicate months to playing a game like this today. But nevertheless, we were able to do it then. We had issues with player background, knowledge of the campaign and the rules, how much to try to teach and communicate beforehand, how much to let players learn on the way. And that's just a judgment call. You want to get players into the game, but you don't want to overburden them with too much information in the beginning. There was a question about the realism of the victory conditions. Again, not a distributed game condition, but there was some debate over whether the game should have ended the way it did. Those were conditions that were provided to the players at the beginning of the game, so we couldn't change them at the end. It wouldn't have been fair, but nonetheless, that was a question. And then finally, the question of running the game as a Kriegspiel versus playing a board game online. And, and what we decided in the end, it's better to lean toward the Kriegspiel because it's possible sometimes for players to get caught up in the board gaming, impression of the game and too bogged down in the specifics that it's better off to go with the Kriegspiel. But at the end of the game worked, and we were all pretty happy with it. So here are some recommendations and final thoughts of the large distributed game. I would say if you're going to do something like this, organize as much as possible ahead of time to save time and to reduce player burdens and referee burdens. Have forms for sending in orders. Have forms for sending back results. Those kinds of things, and help people with processes just to streamline things. And in the same vein, streamline game functions where possible. That means in the working of the game and how players operate their units, how they communicate. Streamline that where you can. If you don't need the detail, you can leave it out to make things a little bit easier. Provide player encouragements to keep the game moving, and that's a social issue, and that's a social bandwidth issue that I think comes up in all distributed gaming, and it's just something that you all should be aware of, and the referee can help with that. And I consider a pregame test move or even a social event to bring players together. Again, that helps with the social bandwidth. Players know each other. They're more likely to interact more effectively and more happily, and it can help players learn the game and just enjoy it better. You should have contingency plans for player absences. We were able to work around that. In some cases, we had subordinates take over for superiors, but and that worked reasonably well in our game. But that's something you want to think about if someone has to travel or get sick, for example, and can't participate. You want to have some way to deal with that. And again, at the end, when in doubt, favor the Kriegspiel over rigid game rules. It just makes things go more smoothly in the end. So what I would say is distributed gaming can create great opportunities. Player participation, 29 players across the US and in the UK. That was a great accomplishment, I thought. Limited information, we were able to handle that effectively, and create some of the challenges that the commanders faced in 1863. Provides extra time for game step resolution, particularly the way we were doing it asynchronously, that I could take days between moves to resolve game moves and then send the information back to the players. And these are all things that work well in a distributed format that don't necessarily work well or don't work at all face to face. I mean, the multi-blind aspect of it. So all in all, it was a successful experience, and I might do it again sometime. We'll see about that. But again, a successful experience.
So thank you very much, Sean. I remember talking with Peter Perla and some other people who were playing the game, and it was the classic case of people, like, oh, I got that guy, and this guy's pissing me off, and it was wonderful. It was the standard effect of a war game. By the way, the International Kriegspiel Society is trying to recruit you through the comments. They'd like you to join their organization.
It sounds like it would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does sound like it could be a lot of fun. So with that in mind, we're going to now turn it over to Stephen Downs-Martin and Charles Turnitsa to talk about the CISO Working Group report. So Stephen, is this one of those times where you don't want your face on the screen?
Just in a couple of seconds, when we throw up the slides, I'd like my face removed from the screen, because I know that I will be distracting. My handsome appearance distracts people.
So we'll go ahead and remove both your face from the screen. And I think I speak for everybody who's watching this that we're all on board with removing your face from the screen.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great idea. So if you'd throw the slides up and take all the faces off the screen. Thank you. So perfect. Hello, everybody, and thank you for watching. I hope you're watching. Chuck Turnitsa and I were part of a much larger working group back in 2021, sponsored by the CISO organization. Let's now see if this works. Yes, has the slide changed on everybody's screen? Somebody give me a thumbs up.
It's looking good, Stephen.
Okay, great. So this is a working group report that we published in August 2021. There's the link to it down there. If you just go to PackSims and look for distributed wargaming, you should find it. A shout out for that list of contributors. I haven't counted them. I've long since forgotten, but you can see there's about 15 of them down there, all of whom wrote papers and engaged in discussion over about 8-month period. So it was a study in depth. And the question we're asking ourselves, the question that Chris asked is, what have we learned since that day? Well, to answer what you've learned since a day, you have to know what you actually knew on that day. So we're just going to quickly walk through the conclusions of the working group report, the executive summary, and then discuss, what has changed since then. So we start out with the key structures of a distributed gaming taxonomy. And there's little here that actually doesn't apply to wargaming in general. The geographic separation, I think it was Peter Pellegrino that pointed out that even so-called undistributed war games are distributed in a sense. Most large-scale professional war games have red and blue in separate rooms within the same building. It's only a short hop, skip, and a jump from having those separate rooms in different buildings and in different states. So geographic separation can be isolated, each individual sitting on their own, a bit like Sean Barnett described. They can be clustered, red and blue cells in the same room. They can be co-located, everybody in the same room. How is gameplay, how does it proceed? Is it asynchronous? Is it staggered? Is it synchronous? These are all game design issues that are critical for distributed games, and we have to deal with them in part in any type of war game. The network classification starts introducing something rather interesting. You can have TSSCI games within a TSSCI cleared building much easier than you can across in a distributed way between buildings or between across places, organizations that are greatly distributed. You can use SCIFs, but SCIFs are small and they are in high demand. You can be in the middle of your war game and the general walks in and says, right, clear the room. A real world operation has been triggered and I need the room. And that doesn't do well for your war game. And there are game tools that now come into play. The ones that are dedicated to gaming, most war game organizations have those in-house, but there's a whole range of collaboration and productivity tools from industry and business that you can bring to bear. These are decisions, design decisions that you need to take account of. Now, these are the design topics that we talked about during our working group and wrote up in detail. When you're in a non-distributed game within an organization, you have a limited variety of standardized equipment. Most organizations lock onto particular machines, particular operating systems. They have 1 or 2 networks available, and that has its advantages. In a distributed game, different organizations and indeed different individuals can bring their own devices to the game. The issue there, of course, is interface technology. The formatting of signals from one organization to another needs to be standardized. And the question now is, what did we come across that was problematic when we all went through COVID and started trying to do distributed gaming? What did we learn from that? Data collection, in some senses, that stays pretty much the same. The problem there is a critical part of data to be collected that often is not considered is the body language, the tone of voice, and the interpersonal dynamics within game cells. The rapporteur can keep an eye on that and add comments to the game report about whether people were being dominated, whether the behavior was good, and so on. It's very hard to do that in a distributed game, watching people on your small screen. In addition, when everyone's co-located at least within a building, you can control back-channel communication between people. When you are distributed, there's nothing to stop someone in red picking up their cell phone and phoning their best buddy in blue and subverting the game. And yes, we've seen that happen, and it does happen. It happens even within a building, those buildings for which cell phones haven't been forbidden. I took part in a game in which we had to put in place GSM jammers to stop people doing that, and put someone inside the restrooms to keep an eye on who's going in and talking to whom. It's harder for individuals to dominate a group via teleconference systems, but it's also harder in some sense, it's easier for facilitators, a smaller number, to jump from room to room. It's a sort of instantaneous teleporting into a room to watch what's going on and provide assistance during a distributed game. We've talked about information flow already. A couple of topics that come up. When you're in a distributed game, it's harder for senior people to intimidate junior people. You can hide the identity of people, and so on. You can stop a flag or general officer by their simple presence in a room dominating the conversation. It's harder for them to do that in a distributed game. Online and video delivery is an interesting one. A decade of education research into delivery of material and engagement with students via video and teleconference has provided a range of insights that are in fact relevant to distributed wargaming, and those should be considered when designing the formatting and pacing of information provided to players during distributed games. There's a lot to be learned from what the high school education and the university education world learned when they switched over to distributed education. We've already talked about security and the problem with using SCIFs. It's subject matter expert support. You can get a much wider range of subject matter experts to support your game if it's distributed and asynchronous than you can if it's all co-located in a single building. Travel costs drop dramatically, and it's easier to get someone for a few minutes, for a few hours, than have them transport themselves and spend a week somewhere. We've talked about subversion of the game objectives already. Distributed game, high demand, very senior leaders or high demand people of any kind, it's easier to get them into the game. You don't have to fly your general across the country so that he can give a 1 hour welcome or a 1 hour debrief at the end. He can check in via the telecommunication protocol. And the same for now. Okay, so in technology, we've already mentioned that in a little bit. There are a whole range of online software tools used by gamers in the unclassified arena. We'd like to use those for government purposes. That's an obvious first move. There's also an obvious difficulty. Those of us who work in national security organizations understand this. Attempting to get new software authorized for use on government networks is a real problem. There are, in fact, ways around that, and we can talk about that later. Finally, a warning. Technology is not a substitute for wargame design expertise. Okay, without the latter, your great technology will simply allow you to produce bad war games very efficiently. Yes. And widespread, which makes it even worse. Efficiency is not the sort of end goal here. Having a medic make my heart work very efficiently when I'm suffering an arterial event with a cut artery is a surefire way to rapidly introduce disaster. I'm going to hand over now Oh, I wasn't using. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Chuck for the hard stuff.
All right.
What's the past? How did we take advantage of the benefits, and how did we overcome the downsides? Are we still doing distributed wargaming, or have we switched entirely back to co-located? And how can we transfer the benefits of distributed gaming to co-located gaming? Because if we're going back to co-located gaming for all the advantages that has, we don't want to just throw away all the benefits we discovered. How do we ensure lessons learned are used in the next pandemic? And by next pandemic, it's in quotes because there'll be other reasons we have to go distributed. How can we transfer the lessons learned to distributed planning in war? If we found distributed wargaming difficult, I'm going to suggest it makes distributed planning when people are actively trying to kill you a lot harder. So, Chuck, why don't you lead the discussion about some of these topics?
Yeah, actually, I think in a perfect world, what would be great is if we could ask these questions of the audience, but I know we're sort of limited time. A couple of the things that we learned, I'll address, sort of these past things first. A couple of things that we learned, how do we take advantage of the benefits of distributed gaming? One of the things you saw in Stephen's litany on the taxonomy of game design and how it's affected by distributed gaming, some of those things are actually easier or beneficial or have side benefits from distributed gaming. And I think those become clear the very first time you run a distributed game. For instance, capturing information. All communications are recordable or recorded. It's very easy to go back and check on that. At least all official communications. There's a number of other things. You can very much control the flow of information as the game staff, because it all originates with you. You don't have a as much as it pains me to say this, you don't have an analog display of the situation on a table with movable counters, movable markers, right? And as one side or another is viewing it, they're going to pick things up, move them around, and so on. It's digital. It's controlled by the staff. So that's another benefit. As far as the downsides, as somebody who's taught online for over a decade now, and also run a number of different online distributed games, I think one of the difficult downsides is getting people to communicate, getting people to actually take that step to communicate, even within the same team, within a cell, within a team. There's sort of a hesitancy to do that. I believe, at least from my personal experiences, in running a distributed game, one of the things that can help is if the staff kind of go in and prompt people, or if you talk to a cell leader and have them prod and prompt some of the cell members, by asking them questions, by trying to get them to participate, that helps. As far as the present, and of course, once we get to Q&A, I certainly would love to hear other stories or questions in these areas. As we get to the present, I think we heard just earlier from Ed that just 5-10 minutes before our forum here started, he's talking to people about distributed war games that are still ongoing. I think the world in general, after or having lived through the COVID experience, at least we're still in this phase, has embraced online communications and distributed communications for a lot of different activities. You have more people working from home, working remotely, more people doing school remotely, and so on. The same thing applies to war games. We've seen many of the advantages of being able to engage people regardless of geography, whether they're subject matter experts or game teams or game leaders or game designers. And so I think there's a lot of benefits, and people realize that. And so we're still seeing distributed wargaming. We've not switched back entirely to co-located wargaming. There's a lot of people who miss that, right? And there are a lot of benefits to a co-located war game. And some of them are even institutional benefits, right? The networking, the socializing, and so on. I mean, face-to-face networking, of course, in this instance. And so there are reasons for co-located wargaming, but there's also a lot of benefits for distributed. So I think it's not going to go away. Now, for the future, how do we translate some of the benefits of distributed gaming to co-located wargaming? There's a good one. If we look at some of the benefits as arising from the fact that information distribution and communications have to be through electronic channels, how do you force that in a co-located game? If you have set up a some sort of comms system, whether it's mimicking a real life, C2 comm system, radio network, whatever, trying to make your cells feel like they're distributed geographically more than they actually are. How do you force people to use that? And that's kind of up to you, game designers. But if you can, then you have the benefits of being able to capture communications and record them for after action review and commentary and so on, analysis. So that's just one example. There was a lot, I believe, published, a lot discussed in online forums, in publications, and so on about distributed gaming during and following this past, pandemic event. And so hopefully those things will be available and remembered, to be considered during the next, quote unquote, next pandemic. Hopefully, this was a 100-year event and we won't see another one in our lifetime, but really, who knows? And if something like this comes up again, if something comes up where travel is challenged, where co-location is challenged, I think we'll be in a better shape for the next time that something like this occurs, if the lessons from this last event are heeded. And the same thing goes to distributed planning. If as Stephen pointed out, if we had a hard time doing distributed wargaming where we're mimicking a C2 structure, how much harder is it going to be, fighting a war where we actually have a distributed C2, an actual distributed C2 structure? It's done to a certain extent today. What do we do in a situation where we have contested comms, disrupted comms, issues like that? How are we going to deal with that? I think those are things that are being looked at now, and certainly in a much larger venue than just in wargaming. So it'll be interesting to see if the lessons that we learned kind of filter up to, the C2 world and the comms world. Stephen, am I missing anything?
No, I think you've got it all there. Couple of points sort of surfaced in my mind as you were talking on the telecommunications in a distributed game. I know that Rex Brynan, for example, at McGill University, uses cell phones and Wi-Fi for very large distributed games. He has his game players, some of them stuck out in muddy fields because they're the refugees, others in nice warm rooms inside because they're the humanitarian aid organization, and communications go between individuals in a wide sort of spread out network as people move around. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff that one can do with if one just embraces distribution.
An interesting strange kind of example that I could bring in. It's not exactly a war game, but in the model railroading world, there's a lot of very large layouts, at least in the U.S., owned by clubs, run by individuals who are fortunate to have a large layout and so on, where they have operation sessions with 15, 20, 25 people at a time in a session, mimicking the daily operations of a large railroad, right? And you have people in the role of engineers, you have people in the role of dispatchers, you have people in the role of yard masters and so on. And in many of those systems, they're using electronic comms back and forth, and they're doing it, gladly. And it really helps. It really helps with not only, if you're across a 75 by 40 foot room, talking to the yard master on the other side of the room without shouting over everyone's head, if you're talking through electronic comms, it actually helps with the immersion and feeling like you're part of an actual railroad that's operating over 200 or 300 miles of real landscape, and you're 150 miles out from the yard, but you need to talk to the yard master. Doing these sort of constrained electronic channel information sharing and communications, I think there's benefits there. It's not always a challenge. There's benefits other than being able to capture information. I wanted to toss that as my last thought.
The Sean Barnett raised a point about real life interfering with people playing games, which is why having in some senses, having an asynchronous distributed game sort of solves that problem. People can come and go into the game. Yes. A co-located game, people have flown in and are taking part in a game. It's a lot harder for their boss to drag them out of the game cell and tell them to do something when their boss is 500 miles away.
Yes.
So, there are advantages in getting everybody together, and there are disadvantages, mainly cost, etc. Why don't we take the slides down? Thank you. And give up our time to Ed, I think it is.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And now we will turn it over to Ed McGrady, who is in the time since while Stephen and Chuck were talking, I believe he executed a distributed war game during the time where we were talking. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Ed and let him talk for a little while.
Yeah, I don't have any fancy briefings or anything like you've seen so far, and I'm not as smart as a lot of the guys like Pete. But so I just tend to be the guy from the perspective of digging holes and throwing cement in the holes. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit, some of the more practical aspects of this, because I do it, as Chris says, quite a lot. The reason I do it a lot more than many people is simply because I do everything unclassified. And so I'm a completely unclassified operation. I do not deal with Department of Defense very much. I deal with foundations. I deal with nonprofits. I deal with all kinds of different people. Because of that, I can rely on distributed gaming a lot more than I think other people can. So I basically have some lessons learned. But I want to start off with a bit of story time. So, and I only have one slide. I'm going to show it during my stories. The pandemic happened in like March, and we had been doing up to that point with CNAS a whole series, Center for New American Security, a whole series of games looking at various aspects of the potential conflict with China. These had been large games, 30 to 40 people, large maps, me standing in the middle, adjudicating the way I want to do with them. And again, all at the unclassified level, to look at various issues for various sponsors. When the pandemic hit, we had a game that was due the first week of April. And of course, because of the travel restrictions, because everything had hit, we couldn't do it. So I had to transition from a for real sort of in-person game to a digital game over the course of about 2 weeks before we had to do it. And we then proceeded for the next approximately 2 years to continue to do these games online. And these are not small games. The idea was that we could transition to online, and that opened up a whole bunch of possibilities for us to do things. In particular, it opened up the possibilities for double blind. And I'll show you what I mean when I say these online games. If you could show the slide. I just wanted to show a picture. This is a control slide from Move 4, because I never relabel my moves. From Move 4 of Game 5, so this was fairly far into this particular series. Move 4 for Game 5 with control for and this is the control view. What I can do is I can split this, right? I can have the red view and the blue view. I can also annotate it and do a whole bunch of different things to provide feedback to the players on their moves as game control. A couple of notes: keeping track of all the pieces in this game, and because as you can see, there's more than 0. Is quite the challenge, particularly when you have to divide it between red and blue. In addition, conveying it to the players at this level of resolution can be an enormous challenge in terms of the amount of bandwidth and or file size that you need to deal with. And it was really difficult at first. At first, I was relying on PowerPoint to do this. And the PowerPoint files were just too huge to really be usable. And so eventually I settled on a shared workspace concept, which was the G drive. And if you put these up in the G drive, you could actually all move stuff around collaboratively and do stuff and essentially play the game on the G drive. Now, you would immediately say, for a game like this, why the heck didn't you use Vassal or some other tool? That's because I had 30 to 40 players, none of whom were wargamers, many of whom were military or defense professionals. And in some cases, they're like dialing in from a phone in the middle of Australia trying to play a game. And so you don't really get the opportunity to go fancy with your technology or use specific technology because these people do not have time to train. They are not going to learn a specialized piece of software. And something like the G drive, which essentially mimics PowerPoint, is something that everybody can pretty much get behind. But I just wanted to give you an idea in this slide of the scope and the scale of what I was dealing with. This particular scenario is bizarre because we wanted everybody out of area in the Western Pacific fighting over a piece of Australian real estate. But nonetheless, it shows the complexity of what I was dealing with as I transitioned from real world to virtual, and the challenges in terms of adjudication and keeping everything straight. Throw in another challenge, they would only give me about a half an hour to adjudicate all this mess. So there's a lot of time pressures. Thank you for taking the slide down. So there's a lot of time pressures that come with this sometimes, particularly for online. So we did that, and it worked pretty well, and we evolved over time. And one of the things I want to talk about is how we evolved, in particular, some lessons learned in terms of the size and scope and the way we present information within the context of the distributed wargaming. And there's also some key lessons, not only just about this, but about all the various kinds of games I've done. I've done climate games in Shindig. I've done games with the Taiwanese military in teams. I have a lot of different various experiences with trying to do this in a distributed environment. And there's some basic lessons which you should really perhaps listen to. So what are the key factors? One of which, I think the biggest problem we had as we went into the moving from real world to virtual was the collaborative shared spaces. I can't use a collaborative shared space that effectively someone who has no idea how computers work and no idea how war games work can use. Okay, that's not usable to me because inevitably, if I have a game, I will have players in it who don't know either, and so I need. I call them naive players. I need something that naive players can deal with and not necessarily collapse their entire mental system. I've settled on the Google Drive. I think sharing PowerPoints back and forth is insanity, but that's what I started doing, and that didn't quite work. I've worked with a lot of virtual whiteboards and virtual collaborative environments, which are useful for player ideation. If the players can do it, and a lot of times people struggle with virtual whiteboards and such, but if the players can do it, they can do a lot of virtual ideation and a virtual collaboration in a shared environment. It's not really a venue for me to present stuff, though. I need a lot more control. I need to be able to take it offline and do stuff as control. And the virtual shared workspaces just don't work that well. Likewise, something like Vassal doesn't really meet it for me because, first of all, I have to convert all my stuff into Vassal, which is a major overhead for me. And a lot of times I'm doing one-off games. So it's a lot of overhead for a one-off game to convert it into Vassal. And so that doesn't quite work for me personally to do that sort of thing. If you're going to do something you're going to play over and over and over again, you say, well, the China games, you're playing them over and over again. Yes, I am, but it's a different scenario every time, different force structure, different location. So I'm going to have to still do a different layout for Vassal. I can't just do one game and have it cover everything. And yes, this is very much what I was doing for the China scenario, is very much like OWS, Operational Wargaming System. And that has certainly opened up a lot of possibilities with OWS for doing operational level games if you have access to it, which I wouldn't because I am not a government contractor. The other thing that I've considered, but I have not explored too much, but I think has a lot of potential for what we do is a Roll20 like environment, an online role-playing environment. There are several of them. Roll20 is the one I'm familiar with. If you can figure out how to use those environments to do your game in, that might be another alternative and a collaborative space, because you can of course share stuff. One of the biggest problems I have is convincing people of die rolls, or doing realistic die rolls. I have explored many different alternatives. I tend to do the die rolls myself, but that doesn't really convince anybody what the die roll is. I did buy this fancy little thing that creates die rolls when you spin it and then you stop it, which works really well, but it's very awkward to use, as you just saw, face to face. Like I say, Roll20 would solve some of those problems for you, as would Vassal if you could get your stuff into it. The other thing, though, I think we haven't talked, but I think Stephen and Chuck talked a little bit about, but I want to talk a little bit about more, is text and chat. You have your collaborative shared workspaces where we're going to share your information. Then you have how people are going to talk to each other using text and chat. And notice I'm saving video and video and audio for last. Text and chat are a really interesting problem. I've found that text and chat give you a texture and an ability to control the game, an ability to supervise the game that doesn't really exist in Zoom. And that because Zoom and a lot of the other online tools for voice and video don't do chat very well. But if you take and use something like Slack, and I'm a particular fan of Slack, you can create multiple channels. You can see kind of all the channels at the same time. You can bounce between the channels. Another major helpful thing with Slack is that you can upload large documents, which is how I was pushing PowerPoint in the first few games, is we're using corporate Slack and have everybody get a Slack account, sign in, which is itself its own challenge. Sign in and be able to push large files to everybody over Slack. Even if you're using a collaborative space like G Drive, the ability to push files to people over something like Slack is a very big advantage. And as I will talk about a little bit when you start talking C cubed, the text and chat feature is very interesting variant on that. Discord would be the only other option to Slack that I could see. Inline chat and stuff, chat and stuff within Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something is too perishable and too weird to actually use effectively. And so you do need to go to something like either Discord or Slack. The big problem with Slack is it's corporate, right? You're going to be paying a lot of money for a Slack account. And especially if you're using it just for games, it's probably not worth the overhead cost to use Slack. And so something like Discord becomes a feature. With either Slack or Discord, you have the naive player problem. Players won't understand how to get into it. They won't understand how to set it up, and that can be a huge advantage. Well, Chris mentioned in the chat that they have to create hidden channels in Discord. Slack gives you a lot of tools that you can manage people's interactions, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. Then it comes video and audio, and I've used a whole bunch. I looked in my Mac permissions thing for my camera just to come across all the various things I've used to try to control games, and they range from Shindig, which is an interesting platform. It's one of these virtual meeting spaces, so you can have a presenter, and then you can have people wandering around the presenter floor and interacting with each other, little avatars going back and forth. It's kind of a cross between Second Life and a presentation version of Zoom. I've used that. I found it to be unnecessarily complicated. And I especially found that with a lot of these programs, and it may have changed because I know that the programs always evolve, but a lot of these programs limit your ability to move between groups. And that is one of the biggest problems I have for using anything for games that's video and audio. Is programs that limit your ability based on your position or account or how you're set up to move between groups, and something like Shindig does do that. It really screws with your ability to control how people move around the game. and that creates a problem. I've also dealt with Blue Jeans, WebEx, GoToMeeting, Google Meet. All those kind of meeting kind of things are fine, but they're kind of just like a bad version of Zoom. And again, this problem of people moving between rooms and the creation of a sub-room so people can go off and talk to each other is always a kind of a lurking issue for a lot of these kind of platforms. My preference for video and audio, as always, is Zoom. I think Zoom gives you a lot of flexibility to open and close rooms, to move people between rooms, so they can collaborate, to allow people to move between rooms. And in fact, if you have a good person that's running the Zoom session for you, they will know that you can actually permit people to move between rooms without actually having to make them a co-host. And that capability is really great, because now I don't have to the players can wander around. It's like a virtual meeting space. Players can wander around. I can wander around. There's a plenary session available that I can force all the players to come back to. Zoom has a lot of very useful features. And so I've always sat on Zoom, not so much for the chat. The Zoom chat is very weak, but I've sort of hit on Zoom as my preferred way of doing things. Then we come to Microsoft Teams, okay? I consider Microsoft Teams to be a denial of service attack against getting anything done in terms of gaming. I have had situations where we've been forced to use Microsoft Teams, and I've literally had to open up a separate Zoom session so we could actually talk to each other about all the problems we were having dealing with Microsoft Teams. And that creates all kinds of issues with feedback and chaos. Microsoft Teams, at least the small version, there's sort of individual Microsoft Teams and corporate Microsoft Teams. When I say Microsoft Teams is a denial of service attack against getting anything done, I'm talking about the individual version. And for the individual version, it has a lot of issues, again, with people moving between rooms. It has a lot of issues with your ability to control the environment as someone who is not the overall overarching host. I really hate working on Microsoft Teams, and I will actively try to discourage people from using it. Now, Microsoft Teams Corporate, which I have used a couple of times, is an institutionalized version of Microsoft Teams. And that tends to be common in educational environments. And that does tend to have a much more collaborative shared workspace kind of concept, because they have classrooms and they want people to collaborate and they want to build collaborative spaces. And there's a lot more flexibility in the corporate institutional teams than there is in the individual teams. And so you just have to keep that in mind. The problem with the institutional teams is it's really, with any Microsoft product, it's really complicated to use. And it's complicated to administer, and it's complicated to get set up right, and it's complicated to get everyone into Teams. Every time I try to get into Teams, since I have like 4 or 5 accounts, because I've done 4 or 5 different things for different people institutionally, I always get problems signing into Teams because of that. So I still think Teams is a bad idea. The educational institutional Teams is a less bad idea than the individual teams. Now, one of the things we had to do as part of that China game series was look at command and control. And so this was done towards the end of our run with those games. In fact, the game I just showed you, the slide I just showed you, was one of those instances where we're looking at command and control. And so now I said, okay, let's do command and control. Let's do it the right way. We have shared picture. Google Drive with the slides in it is our shared common operational picture for both red and blue. We also have Slack, which provides text access and low bandwidth communication for the players. And then we have video and audio, which provides high bandwidth allocation for the players. So what we did is we made up a matrix. Depending on the current situation with regarding to, cable, SAT, UHF, VHF, HF, and all the various Fs, depending on what Fs were going on and how things were happening in terms of communications, I limited communications between the different player groups. So we literally had, like JFAC forward, JFAC rear in Hawaii. We had CONUS, POTUS. We had PACOM. We had the JTF forward, which was 7th Fleet. We had the actual component commanders, and they were all in separate rooms. Again, this is 30, 40 people. We're actually playing the operation at the operational level. And we would control communications between the various player groups depending on the current status of their comm suite, based on the assessment of what people were doing. If there was a lot of ASAT-y kind of stuff going on, then we would take out high bandwidth comms, but UHF SATCOM would probably survive, and so I might give them UHF SATCOM. On the other hand, they might be working on relays, so with relays that they still preserve UHF, and so they get slack. They get slack. They don't get necessarily audio and video, which in some cases made them more efficient. And then of course the picture can go up and down, and I can do that within the context of a turn. What I would say is, okay, they're going to get X number of minutes of SATCOM this turn, and so therefore they're going to get X number of minutes of video and audio. They're going to get Y number of minutes of text, and the picture will be available for a certain amount of time. And that worked really well to do that, to sort of bifurcate it according to the different types and modes of communication and different bandwidths, and then manage those with respect to the architecture that was going up. And in some cases, a lot of cases with these games, it would literally sound like a KOC was operating in my house. You know, they were planning their tracks, they were planning their ATO, they were trying to communicate with forward commanders about what they needed in terms of strikes and what the planned strategic strikes were, with buffs coming from the US and that sort of stuff. And so it literally sounded like a KOC. And because we could get that kind of fidelity in the simulation, layering over the communications issues to include cyber and other stuff into the ways people communicated within the game, actually I thought was quite effective. And so I really like that model of, you have a shared common operational picture. Again, I like the G drive. You have Slack as a chat, low bandwidth comms, and then high bandwidth comms are the meeting rooms, and everybody getting a chance to talk to each other. And taking those up and down with a time hack was a really great way to do it. I think in general, when you start talking about this distributed gaming allows you to play with people that might not otherwise participate. A lot of times I'm dealing with heavies, very important people, congressmen, senator, people like that. They don't have time to come to your game necessarily. And so doing it over something like Zoom is very helpful. It can also allow you to pick up a diverse quantity of players. And of course, during the pandemic, we needed to do it just for practical reasons as well. I've also done hybrid events, and somebody mentioned teleporting. I really liked being controlled. I've done both kinds. I don't like it when the players zoom in, because a lot of times that results in the players not paying attention that are on Zoom and getting cut out of things. But when I was in control and I was on Zoom and they had it hooked up so I had max headroom, I could pop up on a TV in any of the distributed rooms. I could literally teleport around the entire game and look in and see what people were doing and give people advice and manage the game much more effectively, I felt, when I was on Zoom than actually I could in the real world, because the actual distributed game was distributed across multiple floors of a building, and I'd have to run up and down stairs. And I did it in person. It didn't work. It worked out much worse than it did online with distributed. So if you're thinking of doing a hybrid game, putting control in the hybrid role is actually kind of helpful for control, at least in terms of moving between different rooms and keeping an eye on things. Now, of course, I had somebody that was physically on the ground that I trusted who was running control as well. So I think when you're thinking about platforms and when you're thinking about doing these things, you gotta think about, first of all, the challenge of the user. The user doesn't know much. At least my users don't know much. That's why Zoom is so useful. Everybody knows how to Zoom, okay? If you have a large event, and I've done online games where you've had 500 people involved. If you have 500 people involved in your game, it's going to be a different kind of game, first of all. And second of all, you're going to need a lot of event management. You're going to need controllers. You're not controllers as in game control, but people controlling the technology, like what we have here with StreamYard that we're using, and having a director and almost a producer and other people behind the scenes running the various aspects of the show, because eventually it can become an actual show. And so when you have that and moves into that, you really do need a producer and a director to try to handle the video and audio aspects of that. And then the biggest challenge I think that you have is simply sharing information. Face-to-face, you can roll out maps, you can talk about stuff, you can do all kinds of stuff. With Zoom, it's a little more rigid. I have to go into a room and pull everybody back to share information. I have to display my maps, and therefore my face isn't on the screen. There's a lot of trade-offs in terms of how you share information. But again, I've settled on things like the G Drive as my preferred way of giving everybody a shared operational picture within the context of this. And so that's what I do. Like I say, I've got 2 games coming up that we're going to do online. See how that works, and do it every day. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. So I guess I have a question for pretty much everybody here. Some of you actually ran distributed games. Some of you were part of institutions that made the decision not to run distributed games. Some of you spent a lot of time thinking about distributed games and talking to other people who were running distributed games. So I guess the place to start with is you all did some thinking in advance. Ed had less opportunity to do thinking because he had to execute right away. But was there something that surprised you because it didn't work? Was there something where you said like, oh yeah, I'll do X, and it's like you turned out, no, that just doesn't work? Has anybody got anything along those lines? Pete?
Yeah. So this is the danger of ad-libbing.
Yeah.
I had set up a game, distributed. Kids are all, so this was with Sea Cadets. They're all isolated. So this is 2020. Everyone's sitting at home in their bedrooms and kitchens in front of laptops. And we're playing a World War II scenario. It's kind of a Coral Sea.
If I can interrupt for just a second, yeah. Charles just let me know that he has to take off. Thank you very, very much for being part of this, Charles.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry I can't stay around. We're getting to the interesting part now, but I have a hard stop for a work meeting that's started about 5 minutes ago. So
yeah, I'm on leave. So I see you later. All right.
Yeah, you guys take care and enjoy.
Yeah, so we're using, it's a Zoom environment, and I'm not sharing any type of map, because what this is a problem for the kids is they've got a Nimitz, they've got a Yamamoto, and all their subordinate commanders are basically getting just text-based updates for me. I've got the master map here in my office, and as they are sending in orders from the various task group commanders and task force folks and submarine commanders and whatnot, it's up to headquarters to build a picture. So, of course, they're getting all the problems with that type of information flow, and headquarters map doesn't look like the task group commander's local picture, so again, intentional in that structure. So as part of the battle rhythm, there are these times when they're going to get together in a Zoom environment, and it's going to be, I've kind of told this story that essentially think of it as you've got a little bit of leading technology for the 1940s, but you're on your command ship and you're able to run these these conferences with all your commanders from time to time over HF. And that was the intent for them, was to do a lot of work offline, get together and post activities, get some guidance from their respective admirals, share some information type thing, and then come down off the net. I found that they were spending entirely too much time in the Zoom environment and not as much time as I wanted them in terms of thinking ahead and being ready to play, as opposed to doing their thinking together in the Zoom environment. So I come up with a rule. I go, ooh, I know what I'll do. I created this new rule that said, oh, HFDF. Okay, that's kind of a thing, right? So I quickly come up with this idea that they got huff duff, both sides have it. And the longer you spend in a Zoom environment, the greater the odds that I'm going to get a line of bearing from one of the other team's ships, which I will then pass through intel channels to your opposing side, because they're in a mad quest for each other's flagship, right? As they're trying to drive around and find each other in the South Pacific. So I thought, oh, this will be clever. This will teach them how to be short and sharp, be very directive in their comms, get on, get off. No, what they did was I drove them off of Zoom to a separate channel I wasn't aware of. Which, again, I should have anticipated. But again, this was the whole making stuff up as you go. It wasn't tested. I patted myself on the back. It was very clever. I came up with a little rule supplement with pictures of HF-DF units from the 1940s, and I created a little backstory for all of this, and came up with rules about how I would do the lines of bearing and the odds for each line of bearing. Very proud of myself. But again, unintended consequence that, and basically this came back as a broader principle now that I have in terms of distributed gaming. You have to be very conscious of your control circuits over which you're directing the game, as opposed to comms circuits that players are using as in-play experience between game cells, like Ed described, where he's got the different channels that they represent different bandwidths. And one of the sacrosanct rules is don't screw with the control channel, because it's how you're running the game. Well, unfortunately, I had the same. My control channel was my comms channel. And so when I was thinking of it from a comms term, I just drove them off the control circuit. Which took a little bit of undoing and fixing later to get the kids back onto where I could control the game. So that was an example of, yeah, that didn't quite turn out the way I wanted it to.
You're muted, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, you're muted.
Thank you. I once did an exercise when I was at CNA where the blue side ran operational deception against the white cell. For very similar reasons. So, does anybody that's all that none of that surprises me. Those guys could grow up to go off and be in the United States Navy and do exercises because, as you well know, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, quote unquote. So anybody else have anything that, like Sean in particular, I seem to recall that you called some audibles during your game to change some of the procedures, if I remember correctly.
I did, yeah, particularly related to communications. And we had rules about, for the Union Army using the telegraph, that if they were close to telegraph stations, I allowed them to communicate with each other freely, meaning by email, by phone, by meeting, however they wanted to. And what happened was that they were getting very, very clever about doing that. And so they were communicating far beyond what the real commanders could have using the telegraph. If you go back and look at the actual message traffic that happened during the Civil War. So I had to cut that back and say, all right, if you're going to use a telegraph, you really have to be like at a station. And if you're any distance away, I'm going to limit your bandwidth to the number of messages that you can send, because it just became, they were clever, but it became really unrealistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this highlights a frequent issue in gaming writ large, which is all models are wrong. Some models are useful. Your game is just a model of something, and it doesn't have all the real world attributes. So if you don't explicitly put in some of the real world attributes, people figure out ways to manipulate what you did give them and do stuff that you couldn't do in the real world because you just didn't include that piece.
And it's actually interesting to go back and look at what was done in the Civil War, for example, with the units communicating with each other, and you can see the problems that they had. I mean, historians have written about the problem that the U.S. military telegraph organization had, and they had corruption problems where they weren't delivering messages. They were taking private traffic over the network instead of military traffic because they were getting paid. And so, it didn't work the way you might have thought it was working. And so those kinds of sort of real world issues you might not be aware of when you're running a game. And so that is something to think about.
So are we seeing that with Starlink at the moment in Ukraine?
Well, I'm sorry, Stephen.
Are we seeing some of that or something similar with Starlink in Ukraine?
Oh, maybe.
Yeah,
it's
a corporate satellite system being used by military.
Yeah, you hope that they're not taking Russian money and doing stuff that they shouldn't be.
Well, Russia is certainly using Starlink satellites.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I would do in my games is I would always do a die roll each turn to see if we change crypto, because I think we don't have that effect enough in our games. And if you change crypto, everything went down. So
one of the things I found was, in talking about your like Ed's experience with Slack and Teams and BlueJeans and all the other things, is the difference between that corporate version versus that free version. Because I managed to break Google Sites in terms of the free, just, your basic make a Google site. I was only working with 40 students at Dartmouth. Okay. And this was an in-place game, but a lot of the gameplay, I didn't want to have to deal with some of the banking issues as they were transferring money between agencies as part of the game. And I had constructed a Google site, and it was feeding into Google Sheets, all cloud-based, and it worked just fine in my basement. Me testing with 4 users, 40 users. And suddenly I was getting messages across the Google site saying, this website is experiencing unusually high traffic and cannot be kept up to date. Not what I was anticipating from a Google-based service. But again, I'm on the free side. So again, this is that whole, what technologies you bring to bear. There's always some temptation to use some, a free version of whatever. And not all of them are created equal, obviously.
I used the free Gmail. I created a whole bunch of Gmail accounts, which after you create a certain number, you then have to start using your two-factor authentication to let you create another one. And you need to use your wife's cell phone and various other tricks. But I used free Gmail accounts and groups and Google Drive. Large numbers of people that will support that without suddenly locking down. To which I added Zapier, zapier.com. Cost me about $10 to support a game. I was happy to do that out of my own wallet. And Zapier will link all sorts of different email accounts together and combine their information flows into a spreadsheet that you as a controller can then watch flow past without you having to monitor multiple separate communications channels. On top of which that spreadsheet is your data collection for post-game analysis. The thing I saw fail big time with distributed gaming, and take part of the blame for that myself. In a co-located game, you drag everyone into the room. You don't accept what they say they already know about your game tech, and you walk them through the game tech. Mm-hmm. And they are now all up to date on the game tech, which should be as simple as possible. And then during the game, you can look around and see, Joe is having trouble. And you can immediately slide over and help them get back into the game. In a distributed game, I've seen people start to get disengaged because they're frustrated by the technology. It's hard for you to see what they're actually doing on their screen without trying to communicate with them direct and do screen sharing or have them describe. It becomes a lot harder to get people back in the game if they're being frustrated by your game tech. And they will be frustrated by your game tech because you have, so there's an issue there. So perhaps we need to pay more attention to that sort of one-on-one screen sharing while the game is being played to get someone who's frustrated back in the game. I see little of that.
I think that's a good point. Even, with me running the game using email and Vassal, there were some guys who were struggling with Vassal, and I was trying to help them with screenshots, and they were having a hard time following sometimes. And, I had to try to help them, keep up, because you're right. People get frustrated. It's not fun, and they can disengage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
this is where
go ahead, Pete.
I was going to say, and this is where we see like that clustered environment. And I think Ed mentioned this as well. Is, having your man downrange type of thing where, hey, we're playing from only 5 sites. I got a guy in each of those sites type of thing. And I'm not necessarily counting on all the players being at the interface. They can be at the map. They can be doing whatever. But I got a small tech team that's kind of the interface where, okay, so I've heard you discuss. I think I know what you want to do. I'll put the stuff into the tool type of thing. And that way they don't have to necessarily be hands-on. But again, that becomes an overhead issue in terms of now you're sending people downrange.
And you need that guy. You need that person who is going to answer the phone between the different distributed rooms, because a lot of times the players won't. And so if the players walk away and you need to talk to the blue cell, and all the blue cells have gone to lunch, you need somebody there to tell you they've gone to lunch. And so you need that person that is the communications channel for that room, because don't count on the players to be that.
So at the risk of stealing some of Merle Robinson's thunder, because he's doing a 2-hour-long presentation on what happened when National Security Decision-Making Game decided to go online. One of the things that they concluded very quickly was that they needed paradoxically, they needed way more staff to do an online game than they did to do an in-person game, because you had to go to each individual channel. You couldn't just stand back in the room, watch the entire room, be listening to 4 conversations at a time, and go zoom in on the one that was most important going at that time. You had to have people all over the place. And so they realized they needed to double the number of people they had in a game.
I deal with that by bouncing between rooms very rapidly, especially at the beginning of the game. You know how the beginning of the game, you often have a long first turn to let people get acquainted with it. I think in distributed games, you end up bouncing a lot during that first turn, just to make sure everybody's engaged in the game and understanding what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, the only good thing about the issue of technology stuff and players being disengaged at that point, it's never good that players are disengaged. But at least if somebody's disengaged and frustrated and they don't know how to work the tech, they can't sabotage your game. Whereas you have that problem in the real world, just because disgruntled players have a tendency to make everyone else disgruntled, or at least they're disruptive. And every now and then, it doesn't usually happen in the professional world, but every now and then you run into somebody who's just they've decided they're cranky, and they're just going to be cranky about everything, and they're going to get in the way of the game, and they're going to push back on everything, and they're going to be disruptive.
Well, even when not cranky, you can get senior commanders, and I've seen this happen, in the middle of the game decide they want to redesign the game.
Yeah.
And because they're the general or the admiral and everyone around them's an 06 or lower, the game just goes veering off the rails. And you have to have a lot of intestinal fortitude as the game director to drag it back. With a distributed game, it's a lot harder for the general. You can just mute him.
I will say on the other hand, looking at it from the other direction, it is a lot harder as a controller to grab the control back from a panicking sponsor or panicking senior leader in the game and say, no, we need to do it this way. When you're virtual, it can be hard to grab that control back, particularly in a hybrid type situation. And so it's very tricky because you can only shout so loud over the internets, but you can shout a lot louder in person. And so that's a big challenge sometimes when you end up with that kind of catastrophe.
So let's see. Everybody had their COVID experience. Everybody did stuff. What would you have done differently if you had it to do over again? What would you have done differently?
I'd have started doing it a lot sooner because it let me do double blind a lot easier. It was something we should have been doing all along, and we should not have been doing stuff in person.
I suspect that you're an outlier in that opinion. That having been said, that I like that opinion. That's a somewhat doesn't really apply in my current day job because of the nature of the activities that I do. But for the stuff that you're doing, I totally and completely get why that makes sense.
No, I think double blind is great. I mean, and I think that there's a lot to it. That we have a lot of instances where the players have too much information and they communicate too easily, and so trying to inject some of that, I think, has benefits both on the hobby side and professionally.
All right, Stephen, Pete, either of you have a thought on that?
No, it did drive me to get much more familiar myself with a lot of the online communication options and whatnot, and get savvy and to start thinking about how can I bend these tools to my will, in terms of getting my Age of Sail game, its engine is Excel, but because I was going to put that in an online environment type of thing, I had to figure out how to marry Excel to Google Sheets, which actually works out pretty good as an online move form. Type of thing, and how do I close the air gap between a Microsoft product and a Google product? How do I force graphics and animation into Excel So there's a lot of personal stuff that I was compelled to do that, quite frankly, I wouldn't have had the motivator outside of the pandemic to push myself into that. But now I like to keep that in my little my monkey skills of tricks I can pull out from time to time to be able to, again, when people are trying to struggle with a way to think about how to utilize the technology and they don't want to spend the time or money to get a bespoke piece of software developed, which I had the luxury of to some extent, with the War College because of our web developers. But for other stuff, that was probably the biggest thing, was the impetus that the pandemic and going into distributed gaming forced, was to just get smarter on stuff.
And I remember a comment that you made in the last session that that for you at the War College, the pandemic didn't last long enough.
Yeah, if it had lasted longer, we would have been forced into to confront the fact that, okay, so we can pause, but are we going to stop in terms of gaming? When it looked like a pause, everyone could just figure out and rationalize how we're going to hunker down and wait for this to be over so we can return to large scale, hundreds of people, TS level gaming. If that had seen as we're never going back to that environment, then we would have really been forced into exploring how do we get serious about the distributed classified gaming environment, not just as the college, but as the consumer, because it's a two-end problem. Yeah. If the college is sort of like having one telephone, right? Unless someone else has got a telephone, my one telephone does me no good. Unless the fleet also starts thinking about how do we embrace and being part of this environment as well in terms of what's available in mocks, what's available at command centers, et cetera, then again, the college could gear up all it wanted. But unless I had clusters and distributed points at the other end, I was going to be playing my own game.
Yeah. Stephen, any thoughts?
We should have spent. Building on what Pete said, basically, it's the pause versus the. This is actually going to last a long time problem. We should have much earlier started thinking about interfaces between different technologies that were available in different commands and different services. Just basically that the interfaces needed to be dealt with a lot earlier, and organizations, different technologies, bringing them into the fold, authorizing them for use on unclassified machines and getting versions authorized for use on classified machines. We should have started that early and taken the opportunity that COVID gave us to make people do that. I heard a phrase the other day, let's not waste a good catastrophe. I think we wasted a significant portion of that catastrophe.
I have to tell you, Wikipedia has pretty good numbers for most weapon systems. And you're within, 1 sigma of what you need to have. And that's basically all you need for a lot of these fights. And so I don't understand why we're doing everything so classified, but that's just I can run this stuff unclassified, easy day. Now, you may not have the super secret squirrel stuff, but that's stuff, okay, we can talk about that too.
It's plans that are classified rather than, it's the plan that is usually classified.
Well, I in my environment, it's frequently the gear too, but the comment that I make to people is, we're talking about trying to make sure that we get the 4th and 5th digit to the right of the decimal point correct. I'd be happy if we could get the tens column correct.
Yeah, it's a game with human decision makers, right? I mean, the precision that you get. Well, yeah, it's not worth so much.
Yeah, and I mean, and the thing is that I've seen some really, really precise and really, really wrong answers, but they're wrongly precise, right? We're focused. We're totally and completely focused on this level of precision that just doesn't make sense, and we're ignoring the human decision making stuff. Okay, so we should probably finish a little bit early. Because I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm doing 5 hours of panels in a row. But that having
bathroom breaks.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, Ed, but I've got a bottle under my desk.
Thanks for sharing.
But what's in the bottle? Whiskey?
Never drink yellow Gatorade.
Highlight from the audience.
Hang
Oh,
on,
that
it
was part
Oh,
of
there it is.
Yeah, so this was a question that Aaron has actually dropped off the net because he had to go off and do some other stuff, but he's converting this in-person course to be asynchronous, 3-hour, 2-move graded at the game at the end. There was a little bit of discussion taking place in the chat log about how to go about doing this, but just off the top of your head, anybody here have any words of wisdom for Aaron on doing this? Aaron's an experienced designer, but he's looking for inspiration, I guess.
I think he has too many words in that sentence. He's doing a 3-hour, 2-move graded game. That's a lot already, but that's a 3-hour game. Why don't you just do that in Zoom? But now he wants to spread it asynchronously over a week. I don't understand what his parameters are, why he's doing that.
I think that this boils down to he's doing this as part of a class, and he's not the guy who's calling some of those shots.
So would this turn into homework? Is that the idea for?
Yeah, I think that's the idea, that it's going from an in-person course to an online course, and so he's trying to do the game for the online course, and not do it actually in a session, because I think the course is asynchronous.
He'd better work out how to grade it. If it's in person, he can be sitting there watching, and he can grade, performance. If it's asynchronous, students are going to be chatting to each other via cell phones in between each part of the game. So are they being graded individually, or is it a team grade they're getting?
Yeah, no idea.
And there's an issue of keeping everybody, you want to keep all the students engaged, right? I mean, if a homework assignments, there's a risk that somebody won't do their homework, which might be harmful to the game. I don't know.
Or someone will be selling their version of the homework.
It would almost be like if you had to do a group presentation and some member of the group didn't do their assignment. Not that that could.
Yeah, I think he needs to design the game to fit the constraints as opposed to just screwing with the constraints or the technology to try to deal with the constraints. He needs to design the game to fit whatever constraints he's under for whatever situation he's in. And I think he'd probably need a redesign on the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that question fits in the category of we don't have enough information to actually.
No, I think Ed has put his finger on it. Ed has put his finger on it.
Yeah.
Design the game from scratch to fit the constraints.
Yeah, I mean, because when we did student gaming like this, that was asynchronous. It was like, okay, everyone's move's got to be in on, I don't know, it was like Friday. But we said everyone's move. What that meant was each of the 5 teams had 4 players. Each player had a distinct role. So I needed to see the military move from each of the 5 military players. I needed to see the economic move, etc. So everyone had a very concrete deliverable to the grading piece of it. I mean, how do you know if someone's doing their work? It was like, well, it's pretty obvious when someone doesn't turn in the economic move. And then we also provided them an online space. And I said, I don't care how you do it. You can meet in the library. You can get on phones. You can go downtown to a bar. As long as on Tuesday or Friday, whatever the due date was, I see these products uploaded at this time. Then we had the weekend to mash the move together and post out on Monday. Here's the new set of conditions. You have another week to do the next move. I mean, but again, we designed to that environment. We knew that's what we were going to do. And we were using SharePoint at the time. So, I mean, that kind of worked out.
Okay. I tell you what, we'll go ahead and I'll ask Zachary to find another question if there is one. Ed, if you want to roll out because you need to go eat real quick. Since Ed is the moderator for the next panel, I want Ed at his best. So
you won't get that, that's for sure.
Okay. Zachary looks, I think he's looking for questions, but I don't think he's finding any.
No, he says that was it from on the chat side.
Yep.
Okay. All right then. Well then, I guess we're at the point where it's time. Anybody have any parting thoughts?
Don't use Microsoft Teams.
I second that, by the way.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Yeah, I would agree on that. I find I use the corporate version of Teams all the time. I find Teams to be a typical Microsoft product, which is it's just good enough so that you understand what a good product would be, but it isn't that product. So, all right, then let's go ahead and declare victory. One of the things that I always tell the moderators, and as the moderator, I believe in what I have to say, what I've told myself, is that for Connections Online, we schedule a bunch of stuff for 2 hours. We never expect that it will go the full 2 hours. And the goal is not to just fill time. The goal is to let the conversation get to a natural stopping point. So I think we've gotten to a natural stopping point. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this round of Connections Online. We couldn't do it without professionals like yourself being willing to come and volunteer your time to come and do this. So thank you very much, everybody. The next session of Connections Online is going to be Ed McGrady leading a discussion about the impact that Peter Perla had on our wargaming community. And I'll be on that panel, and so will Stephen as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you in the next session of Connections Online. Take us out, Zach.